Every chopper pilot's worst nightmare. Squadron leader Vikas Puri. Shillong, Meghalaya, the 12th of March 2016. Her voice is soothing to the ears. But nothing she says is pleasant, especially if you're airborne. At a height of 4,500 feet above the Brahmaputra, Natasha's voice pierced through the helicopter cockpit. Her tone was tailored to just the right pitch of matter-of-factness to not jolt the pilots, but with a polite insistence that could not be ignored. As the voice of the cockpit warning system built into the helicopter by its Russian makers, Natasha's was the one female voice no pilot ever wanted to hear. Service tank pump failed, the voice, inflected with a Russian accent, called out. Squadron LDR Vikas Puri, lead pilot of the Mi-17 helicopter, heard Natasha clearly. On reflex, he glanced down at his cockpit instrument panel for details about her warning. A pump feeding fuel to the helicopter's two main engines had malfunctioned. In a second, Squadron LDR Puri had jogged through the flying manual in his mind, like all pilots do. Natasha was programmed to call out any problem the helicopter's systems encountered, big or small. And this was not a big one. The pilot knew that a service tank pump failure was not a major emergency that required drastic action like an emergency landing. Built with several layers of rugged safeguards, the Mi-17's engines had additional pumps to draw fuel in. Everything was okay. There was no need to worry. That would change in the next 30 seconds. The warning he had just dismissed would escalate into a terrifying anomaly that would see the 13-ton helicopter abruptly fall out of the sky like a stone, headed straight for the marshy Brahmaputra valley below. It had been a perfect morning to lift off that Saturday, the 12th of March 2016. Sunny but mild, just after dawn, an uninterrupted, clear sky loomed over the Shillong airfield. The beautiful state capital of Meghalaya, also headquarters to the Indian Air Force's Eastern Air Command, is nestled in the Khasi Hills at an altitude of nearly 5,000 feet. The weather that day could not possibly have been better for the flight bound to the northeast, to forward areas in the frontier state of Arunachal Pradesh and its long border with China-controlled Tibet. It was just another mission for Squadron LDR Puri and his crew that morning, but the cargo, and intended destination, was anything but ordinary. The man who was on board the Mi-17 that day was none other than the head of the Indian Air Force's Eastern Air Command. Air Marshal Chandrasekaran Hari Kumar was to be flown to two newly revived and rebuilt advanced landing grounds at 0 and along in Arunachal Pradesh to inaugurate them and declare them open for flying operations. Having the air marshal on board that particular flight gave the helicopter its special radio call sign that day, Eastern 1. The two airfields on the China border in Arunachal Pradesh were among 8 that the Indian Air Force had identified in 2009 to bring back to life after they had fallen into disuse half a century before. Apart from giving military planners welcome additional air access to the northeast, the revival plan was also intended to be a direct counter to China's aggressive border infrastructure build-up. A valuable benefit was that airfields provided new avenues for tourism into one of the most arrestingly beautiful parts of India. The 1,000 rupees crore project involved giving the 8 defunct airfields new runways, air traffic control towers, buildings to handle cargo and passengers and other infrastructure for flight operations. Air Marshal Hari Kumar, a highly qualified fighter pilot who had once commanded a frontline combat aircraft squadron, was fully aware of the significance and value of the inauguration he was to oversee that day. With him were his wife, Devika, and several officers from his staff, including Air Vice Marshal Manvendra Singh, a qualified chopper pilot. Squadron LDR Puri and his crew had risen early that day in Shillong, and headed straight for the airfield to prepare the Mi-17 before their VIP passengers arrived. A ground run was conducted where the engines were switched on and the helicopter repositioned on the apron, ready for its guests. The weather was great that morning. But we didn't have a moment to lose, Squadron LDR Puri remembers. A violent western disturbance was likely to hit the Arunachal Valley the following day, so we literally had only that day to carry out the commitment. If we missed the window, it was certain to be delayed by about a week. The workhorse Mi-17 successfully passed its ground tests, with all systems reporting normal and ready for flight. As the crew waited, Squadron LDR Puri did a final check with the meteorological office at the Shillong base for a weather update along the path they would be flying to the border areas of Arunachal Pradesh. Though the reported weather at our intended destination was still turbulent but improving, we decided to play it safe, says Squadron LDR Puri, who briefed his crew and reported a final flight plan to the Shillong Air Traffic Control. The Mi-17 would head towards Arunachal, but would make a stop at Tezpur in Assam along the way and wait there until the weather at the forward landing grounds had improved. This was as normal a plan B as there ever could be for an air force fully used to contingency plans driven by fickle weather and terrain in their area of operations. By 0720 hours, Air Marshal Hari Kumar, his wife and the 10-member staff boarded the Mi-17. 15 minutes later, the helicopter lifted off, climbing quickly to 6,500 feet. It safely exited the Khasi Hills and arrived in the airspace over the plains of the Brahmaputra. Since this was an early flight and the airspace was largely clear, ground control in Assam cleared Squadron LDR Puri and his crew to fly directly to Tezpur without any cautionary diversions. The Mi-17 in military configuration is not particularly suitable for VIP transport. Rugged and functional, its large cabin does not shield its occupants from the steady roar of the main rotor or the intense vibrations that course through the machine during flight. But the Indian Air Force loves the Mi-17's toughness, a factor that has seen the government make this Russian-built machine the backbone of India's military chopper strength. With its familiar grey silhouette, the Mi-17 is deployed across the country and on every conceivable mission, from flood rescue in Srinagar to being used as a gunship for assault drills during military exercises and casualty evacuation operations in Maoist hotbeds. It has proven tough enough to even be deployed abroad for India's UN peacekeeping missions in Africa. The Mi-17 cruising that Saturday morning over the Brahmaputra was as reliable a chopper as they come. Everything was copybook perfect. I handed over controls to my co-pilot, Flight Lieutenant Adarsh Gupta, and picked up the map I had organized for the flight, Squadron LDR Puri remembers. It was a highly detailed map comprising a thick stack of laminated sheets of paper that opened out to the size of a bedsheet. It was far from handy. In the cabin behind the cockpit, a member of Squadron LDR Puri's crew welcomed the passengers on board and passed around bottles of water and Tetra packs of juice. Noise from the rotor blades ensured that conversation of any kind was impossible in the cabin. The 12 passengers sipped water and juice, and periodically looked out of the Mi-17's blister windows at the glistening river 6,500 feet below. The helicopter had been airborne for 25 minutes and was flying above the river plains when Squadron LDR Puri put it into a gentle descent to 4,500 feet. Almost immediately, the chopper flew into a pall of haze and visibility dropped drastically. On the controls, co-pilot Gupta quickly checked with Squadron LDR Puri if he could escape the haze by descending further. The request was immediately declined. There was a reason why Squadron LDR Puri wanted to hold height till the helicopter had crossed the Brahmaputra plains. Several reasons, actually. Firstly, the higher they flew, the better the chances of being in range for radio contact. Squadron LDR Puri wanted to remain in touch with Tezpur as much as he possibly could, since he was transporting the area commander and it was likely that ground control would want frequent updates. Secondly, higher flying altitude also had the benefit of greater airspeed and fuel efficiency. Finally, descending further would make the cabin uncomfortably warm. In the absence of air conditioning, the higher the helicopter flew, the cooler the cabin would be. Descent was therefore ruled out. The Mi-17 was halfway to Tezpur and cruising comfortably at 4,500 feet when Natasha broke her silence once more. We were about 55 kilometers from Tezpur, flying over marshy land and paddy fields south of the Brahmaputra, when the distress sequence started, Squadron LDR Puri remembers. He had correctly deduced that the warning was not a grave emergency, but what happened next made it clear to him that the situation on his hands was what was classified in helicopter flying as rarest of the rare. Squadron LDR Puri instructed his flight engineer, Sergeant Surjit Singh, to investigate the failed service tank pump to confirm Natash's warning. Just as he did so, Squadron LDR Puri noticed that the helicopter was not flying steady and straight, but was slightly inclined to one side. The artificial horizon ball, a cockpit instrument that reveals the aircraft's orientation relative to the Earth's horizon, had jumped to the left at a steeper angle than normal. There was a feeling of being rotated to one side, Squadron LDR Puri remembers. This was definitely not good. Quickly, he cautioned his co-pilot to steady the machine and fly straight so the passengers would not experience any discomfort. The noise of the Mi-17's rotor might be too loud for any conversation that is not conducted through a headset, but it is also the most reassuring noise when you are suspended in midair. The noise made by the constant churning of two engines, the main gearbox grinding and the rotors beating the air into submission is deafening, Squadron LDR Puri remembers. But imagine being in a helicopter when all that reassuring noise suddenly falls silent. The silence arrived in a heart-stopping moment. Squadron LDR Puri threw the map to the floor and stared down at his cockpit instruments in alarm. The main rotor's revolutions per minute had dropped below 88% and the power generated by both the engines was rapidly winding down. In seconds, the helicopter would be stripped of all engine power. Squadron LDR Puri had flown hundreds of hours in Mi-17s and other types of helicopters in service. He instantly knew what was coming. One of the worst nightmares for twin-engine pilots. That's what it was. Taking back control from his co-pilot, Squadron LDR Puri pushed down the collective lever to his left. In a helicopter flight, lowering collective would lessen the burden of staying airborne that is imposed on the rotors. With both the engines dying, the control input Squadron LDR Puri had just provided pushed the Mi-17 into autorotation, a situation where the main rotor turns by virtue of the air moving up through it rather than powered by an engine. For a fraction of a second, it was hard to believe that both the engines of our aircraft had failed and we were autorotating. It was something which happens next to never in a twin-engine aircraft. Both the engines going off together is perhaps the rarest of rare emergencies, Squadron LDR Puri says. Jostled in the cabin with his wife and staff, Air Marshal Hari Kumar stepped up to the cockpit. A professional pilot himself, he was fully aware of what an in-flight emergency could be like. Cool but serious, he asked the pilots if everything was normal. Squadron LDR Puri nodded back, but he knew that things were anything but. The other senior officer being flown that day, Air Vice Marshal Manvendra Singh, was a veteran Mi-17 pilot. Singh had been Squadron LDR Puri's station commander at Udampa in J&K and his contingency commander during a deployment to the Democratic Republic of the Congo for UN peacekeeping duties. The crew knew, therefore, that the passengers would be quite aware of how dire the emergency was. All-out panic appeared imminent. Meanwhile, Flight Lieutenant Gupta, in disbelief, busied himself attempting to figure out if it was the autopilot that had malfunctioned to push the helicopter off its steady bearing. But if the two dying engines were not enough of a nightmare, the situation was about to deteriorate exponentially. Two generators of the Mi-17, which drew power from the spinning main rotor, were now failing too. This meant that every instrument and system on board the helicopter would soon suffer the equivalent of being simply unplugged. Natasha chimed in with the inevitable announcement. The cockpit voice warning came on announcing the failure of the first and second generators with the chattering sound of warning lights flashing in the background. Autopilot had failed and our compass system had also switched off. Every system on board was dead, Squadron LDR Puri remembers. The chopper had begun to plummet through the sky at a rate of 10 meters per second. The steady death of rotor power made it an unwieldy, unaerodynamic object that was jerked about by wind currents as it fell. Squadron LDR Puri ordered Flight Gunner Ajish to ensure that the passengers were seated and secured as he decided on his next course of emergency action, a possible crash landing in a paddy field. As he fought to steady the lopsided, falling Mi-17, he scanned the ground, which was now 3,500 feet below, for a safe clearing. He knew that touchdown at this rate of descent would be violent, if not a complete disaster. I hunted for a landing ground. We were flying over marshy land and flooded paddy fields. It had rained too. I could not identify any spot for an emergency landing, Squadron LDR Puri remembers. The in-flight emergency had become a matter of life and death. Flying the dead chopper now, he fought to keep it steady and in a gliding path for a few more kilometers in the hope that a clearing would present itself. He reduced airspeed to give him and his crew a few more seconds in the air as they fell towards the ground. All preparations were being made on board for an emergency crash landing. Flight engineer Singh began turning off all systems to lower the chances of a fire breaking out on impact with the ground. But Squadron LDR Puri stopped him. "Hold on," the pilot called through his headset to his 3 crewmates. They stared at him. The Mi-17's rate of descent had crossed 12 meters per second. Squadron LDR Puri paused for a moment, running the scheme in his head once more before issuing the order. It was a huge risk, but it needed to be attempted. "Let's try to relight and restart the engines." Drawing on years of training in the most critical in-flight emergencies, Squadron LDR Puri was convinced that the Mi-17's 2 engines had died from fuel starvation. He ordered the flight engineer to switch on the fuel bypass valve. But for the actual reignition of the engines, the crew would need a small onboard auxiliary power unit to be primed and ready, a process that would consume 30 full seconds, a frightful expense in the circumstances. The Mi-17, now at below 2,500 feet, was falling so fast that it would smash into the ground in less than 90 seconds. Those 30 seconds felt like the longest the crew had ever experienced as they waited for the auxiliary power unit to be charged and readied. Not a moment too late, Squadron LDR Puri called out for the first engine to be relit and restarted. The helicopter was now descending at an even more alarming rate. They were barely 600 feet above ground and less than 20 seconds from impact when they realized it. Their plan had worked. The first engine had been successfully revived. In a flash, Squadron LDR Puri ordered his co-pilot to pull up his levers to crank up power to the main rotor. Seconds later, the rotor began feeding on fresh power and spinning faster, rising to 98% full speed. Raising the collective lever, the helicopter was now flying on a single engine brought back from the dead. 15 seconds from impact with the ground and near certain death or crippling injury to all 16 on board, the Mi-17's rapid descent was slowed down to a shuddering hover. From the moment the engines died till the time the Mi-17 stopped falling, just 2 minutes had passed. In that time, the helicopter had dropped 3,500 feet. Squadron LDR Puri remembers being able to clearly see power lines and cattle grazing in fields from that height. But the emergency was not over yet. The helicopter's terrifying fall had been halted, but it was still only flying on one engine. Spotting a rice field that was flooded with water but clear of obstructions and power lines, Squadron LDR Puri carefully maneuvered the Mi-17 towards this possible emergency landing zone. As the helicopter recovered delicately from its auto-rotating flight and began to hover, the second engine too came alive. On hearing the flight engineer confirm that the second engine had started up, I asked my co-pilot to neutralize the levers. "We had just witnessed a miracle," says Squadron LDR Puri. With both engines back to the steady hum and the reassuring roar of the rotors coursing back into the cabin, the Mi-17 slowly climbed back to 2,000 feet. An emergency landing was still an option, just to be sure that nothing else happened to the helicopter. But I decided against it, Squadron LDR Puri remembers. My co-pilot had informed me that the nearest location was in fact our destination, Tezpur. Breaking their 120-second radio silence forced by the emergency, Squadron LDR Puri and his crew now contacted Tezpur Air Traffic Control, informing a dumbstruck officer at the other end that their Mi-17 had just recovered from a twin-engine failure. After a stunned pause, the officer asked if the Mi-17 needed assistance. I laughed to myself. What assistance could we get up there? Squadron LDR Puri remembers thinking. The revived engines were spinning the Mi-17's main rotor at a reassuring rate. But the fuel bypass valve that Squadron LDR Puri had ordered to be activated before the emergency recovery procedure had a disturbing effect. Aviation kerosene fumes were now billowing directly into the passenger cabin. This was a problem. With not long to go before they landed, Squadron LDR Puri was dead against changing any of the emergency settings that had saved the helicopter from crashing. And yet, he could not ignore the comfort and safety of his VIP passengers. Deciding against fiddling with the engine parameters, Squadron LDR Puri ordered flight gunner Ashish to open some of the cabin's blister windows for ventilation. The roar of the rotors became even louder, but in came some welcome fresh air to dissipate the fumes. Carefully controlling the Mi-17 at 2,000 feet, Squadron LDR Puri and his crew flew the helicopter straight to Tezpur, landing 20 minutes later safely amidst a ring of crash tenders and firefighting vehicles that had been deployed by the panicked ground staff. Smiling and relieved, Air Marshal Hari Kumar, his wife and staff disembarked from Eastern One. While Squadron LDR Puri and his crew sealed their helicopter and handed it over for a mandatory investigation by an Air Force inquiry team, the passengers proceeded to the destination a few hours later on board 2 Indian Air Force draft helicopters. Squadron LDR Puri and his men would spend the rest of the day with bewildered officers at Tezpur, wondering how the crew of Eastern One had saved an Mi-17 from twin-engine failure. The pilot's command and control over those 120 seconds would go on to become a legend, not only at his squadron, a helicopter unit at Mohanbari, Assam, but among the larger community of chopper pilots in service as well. It reaffirmed the Indian Air Force's flying training as being among the best in the world. And while a flight safety team from the Air Force would go deeply into the reasons why the dangerous failure took place at all, it would also ironically burnish the Mi-17's credentials as a machine rugged enough to return from the jaws of disaster. Helicopters are not just tricky to fly; when they go out of control, it is virtually impossible to recover them. The fact that the crew was able to bring the chopper back just 15 seconds from a certain crash landing was testament not just to the skill of those flying, but to the machine itself. The incident was therefore considered a vindication of India's decision to bet big on the lumbering Soviet-era design for present and future operations. Those 120 seconds on Eastern One would also be textbook material for the Indian Air Force flying cadets, a disturbing but powerful indication of just how important the training could prove to be. For Squadron LDR Puri, this was a poignant reminder. His own training had been anything but smooth. As a young cadet at the NDA in 2000, shortly after the Kargil War, Vikas Puri had failed maths in his first semester. Certain that the cadet was headed for humiliation, Vikas's divisional officer, March. Sajjan Moideen, had sent a letter to his father informing him that his son, with no real mathematical acumen, needed to switch from science to the social studies stream if he wanted to pass out with his batch. Vikas's father, Vinod Kumar, was furious, but decided to respond to the letter. In a letter to March. Moideen, he began by saying, Gurthain Shahwa Hai Maidan E Yung Mine Wo Tifel Kya Jirend Jo Gutnon Ki Bal Chail. It is only those who ride a horse in the battlefield who fall. How will they fall who crawl on their knees? It was a letter filled with hurt, but with a no-nonsense instruction. Quoted by March. Moideen years later in a blog post, Vikas's father had written, My son has dreamt to become a pilot, and by shifting his stream to social studies you are taking him away from his dream. Vikas may fail, but he will learn. I have handed my son over to you. Do what is required. You can kick him, kill him, but I want to see him as an Air Force pilot. His new license to kick Vikas into shape worked. March. Moideen applied an enormous amount of pressure on the cadet. It worked, but only partially. Vikas managed to barely pass his physical training tests, but his academic performance that semester was an unqualified disaster. He had failed completely. His marks in the mathematics paper were so low that the NDA decided to put him on a relegation list, equivalent to detaining a student for the semester. March. Moideen received the news with horror. What would he say to Vikas's father? What explanation was possible, given that the man had put his son's future in someone else's hands? March. Moideen decided he could not see his cadet relegated. It would destroy whatever will he had to work hard. Every bit of work he had put into the young man would be a waste. Mustering every emotion at his command, March. Moideen made a case for Vikas to be allowed to reappear for the exam instead of being held back for the whole term. The academy agreed. Vikas took the test again a few days later, and passed. He went on to graduate from the academy 3 years later and proceeded to flying school, choosing to be a helicopter pilot. Vikas Puri would fly for 13 years without an incident before the death-defying mid-air encounter 4,500 feet above the Brahmaputra. 10 months after his leadership in the cockpit saved Eastern 1 Squadron LDR, Vikas Puri was decorated with a Vayu Sena Medal for gallantry. The citation read, "In this fearless and courageous effort, he not only saved 16 invaluable lives but also a precious war-waging asset. He showed exemplary valor, bravery, maturity, exceptional professionalism and situational awareness in tackling one of the gravest emergencies in a Mi-17 helicopter."